Today, I'm talking with Shavar Jeffries, the CEO of the Kipp Foundation and an educational equity advocate for more than 2 decades. The Kipp Foundation supports a national network of charter schools serving more than 120,000 students across 21 states and Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the foundation, Shavar was president of Democrats for Education Reform and its affiliate, Education Reform Now, where he led the organization in passing well over 100 policies at the federal and state level that have expanded educational opportunities for low-income students of color. In this episode, I speak with Shavar about his inspirational life story and career, the challenges facing education today, and the incredible impact Kipp schools and the Kipp Foundation are having, providing access to a transformative education for underserved children throughout the United States. I thoroughly enjoyed and learned so much from my conversation with Shavar, and I hope you will too. And now, here's Shavar. Hi, Shavar. It's so nice to see you.
It's so great to see you. Thank you so much for having me on, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
For listeners that don't know a lot about Kipp, would you just give sort of a brief kind of background on Kipp's mission and how many schools there are in the U.S. and how many students you serve?
Yeah, so Kipp, we're a network of public charter schools in 27 different parts of the country. We have over 120,000 children. We have 275 schools within the Kipp network. We're dedicated to serving children in poverty. And so our children are almost entirely from low-income communities, 95% African-American or Latinx. The vast majority would be first-generation college goers. And so we're really dedicated to serving children in poverty who are brilliant and amazing. And yet oftentimes, like I did in the 80s, don't have public school options that are aligned with the greatness of who it is that they are. So we run schools to cultivate their potential and to enable them to fulfill their potential. We've been around for about 30 years now. As I talked about, I was the founding board chair of the Kipp Nork schools. We're maybe the 5th or 6th, 7th Kipp school, something in that ballpark around that time. Now we have 275. And we're very proud to have a track record attested by independent research as well as our own internal data that shows we're one of the leading anti-poverty organizations in the country. Again, the students who attend our middle and high schools graduate from college at rates that would effectively close the college completion gap between students of color and white students. And our kids, again, are overwhelmingly in communities of poverty. And our mission is to reverse that gap. So we want our kids to graduate from college and to pursue competitive careers at rates that will create a gap between them and the wealthiest families in the country. Basically means we want them to outpace everyone. I mean, that's the vision that we have for them, and that's the potential they have. And it's our job to make that happen.
Before I talk to you about all the incredible work that you're doing as the CEO of the Kipp Foundation, I wanted to sort of give the listeners kind of a background on your personal and professional journey to getting there, because it's such an incredible career that you've had. So let's take it back the beginning, take it from the top. Where are you from and where did you grow up?
I'm from the great city of Newark, New Jersey, which I believe with every fiber of my being is the greatest city with the greatest people on the planet. And I grew up in a family of giants and in a community of giants who were brilliant and who were amazing. And yet at the same time, growing up in the South of Newark in the 70s and 80s, we had a variety of different challenges that we faced in our environment. My grandparents who raised me, they were part of the great migration of African Americans from the Southeast up to, their part was to the Northeast, others went to the Midwest, some went to the West Coast, fleeing Jim Crow segregation at the time and looking for opportunities for themselves and their children, their families. In other parts of the country. So by the time I came on the scene in the mid 70s and 80s, there were many opportunities that my family found, but then also many challenges. And so when I was growing up, our school system, notwithstanding how giant the children were, treated us like we were small, treated us as if it didn't really believe in us. It didn't really believe in our potential, didn't really believe in our capacity. And so I had this kind of dichotomy where I would hear my family about, you're the best, you can do all things, there's nothing you can't do, right. You can do everything. And our school systems, frankly, oftentimes had muted expectations about what was possible for young people in the city of Newark at that time. And what kind of put me on an entirely different trajectory to get me to this conversation was a philanthropist named Ray Chambers, who's an icon in the world and absolutely in the city of Newark, created a scholarship program in the mid-'80s for about a dozen or so kids in Newark at that time to get scholarships to go to college prep high schools surrounding Newark. And I was one of those who received that. When I was told I would get this opportunity, I absolutely did not want to do it because I was told I was getting a scholarship to go to all-boys Catholic high school. Going to all-boys Catholic high school, I was not excited about that in 1987. I didn't like...
I can't imagine why. I mean, if someone said to me, you're going to an all-girls Catholic school for high school, I would, I'm with you on that.
No, we had to wear the tan khaki pants, which weren't hot to me in 1987, and the blazer. And so, and coming from Newark, it was in West Orange called Seton Hall Prep. I had to take a few buses for about an hour and 45 minutes each way. So I didn't want to do it. But my girl's like, no, that's what you're going to do. You're going to get on the bus, you're going to get on the 39, you're going to go across town, get on the 24, the 73, the 71, and you're going to go in there and do what they tell you. And that kind of put me on a whole different pathway that kind of led me to where I am now.
So for you, you were talking about, that the expectations of the schools prior to you going to Seton Hall Prep. Was it the teachers? Was it the administration? Was it, I guess, the people that were there? Was it the infrastructure and the people there? What was it about that experience, that the message to you where you felt like it was that the school was telling you that you didn't matter?
Yeah, and I wouldn't go as far as say until it didn't matter, but we weren't really kind of inculcated in the sense of everything was possible for us. So I wouldn't went so far to say we didn't matter, but there wasn't like these high expectations or high standards or broad visions of what it is that we could do. It was kind of, you show up, that was something that was seen to be something that was celebrated. If you can make it through high school, that was something that felt almost as if that was the culmination. Part of it too is our environment. We didn't know people who went to college. That wasn't something that we saw.
Right.
Beautiful working class environment. But we didn't have a sense of the full range of possibilities. And the system kind of reflected that in a lot of different ways. And it wasn't until I got to the prep, which of course was a college prep high school, where the kind of whole broader world kind of opened up to me. And I think part of what happened was so many adults were amazing that I had as I was coming up in education. And at the same time, I think sometimes when you're caught in certain systems with certain habits and certain muscle memory in terms of how it engages with young people in communities, it can kind of have its own momentum that can frankly override not the fact that even in the midst of that, there's so many great teachers and educators who love kids and trying to do the best they can, oftentimes in challenging circumstances.
So you're there, and then, as you said, it's a college preparatory school. So they're talking to you about college, and you're going through that process, and you ended up at one of the best colleges and universities in the United States, Duke. And I bet you were pretty prepared coming from Seton Hall Prep, it sounds like, with having those teachers and everything. In my own experience, my high school was also pretty rigorous. I remember getting to college and feeling like, gosh, I feel pretty prepared for this and, pretty ready to go. How was your experience at Duke?
I love Duke. I had a great time at Duke. I love Duke. I should probably say this too. Part of the education for me too also was growing up in the streets of Newark. So I had this kind of dual education. So I had this kind of high level, best in class kind of technical education at Seton Hall Prep. And then navigating the streets of Newark in the 80s and 90s was a certain type of education too. This was the crack era in the city of Newark. Yeah. This was the war on drugs in the nation, and that definitely hit the city of Newark. The incarceration of large numbers of Black men in the context of that, in an environment where it was a bubble, right? It was constructed by intergenerational racism, intergenerational poverty, so that we didn't see people who went to college. We didn't see people in the white collar economy. Even the blue collar economy is hard for many to access that. So they went to the underground economy. And so we had levels of violence. We had, levels of drug dealing. Crack was obviously highly addictive, and that destroyed families and communities. And so just navigating in that honestly kind of gave me a type of resilience and toughness and kind of creativity hustle is the word some will use it. So by the time I got to Duke, I had this technical education from Seton Hall Prep. Then I had this spirit of go make things happen. Like that's just what I was used to. And so Duke to me was just like this great big, platform where you could do almost anything. You could take any classes. You could create student groups. You could, you could engage in civic and political advocacy. And I just took advantage of all of that. So I loved college. There was just so much there that was available. I mean, coming from where I came from, to be on Duke's campus and have all these opportunities, I felt like I was like a kid in the candy store. And so I would say the mindset I had and the preparation I had both academically and just like in my spirit and orientation, like I had a very much spirit of, I've been through more before I got here, that there's really nothing here I'm not ready to deal with. And so that enabled me to have a great time at Duke and a great college experience.
You talk about sort of coming back home as you're going to Seton Hall Prep. You probably saw the path of some of your friends or peers that didn't have that opportunity to go to Seton Hall Prep. And kind of, you were talking about people without that opportunity turning to different things, right? Because they didn't have that path to college.
I definitely did. And that is part of the reason I do the work that I do now and have done for 25 years is I had so many friends that I grew up with. And look, we all went through many different things. I lost my mom at a young age to domestic violence. That was horrible. My father really wasn't around and my grandparents stepped in. The friends I grew up with had similar challenges, some much worse than that. Some didn't have the grandparents I had, but they were brilliant. They were hardworking. They were creative, but they didn't get tapped on the shoulder in 8th grade to get this scholarship opportunity. They went to Weequahic High School, one of our neighborhood high schools. Some went to Shabazz, some of our neighborhood high schools. And again, many teachers in there and educators who are working their butts off to take care of kids. But the system really just wasn't designed to fully cultivate their potential. And so those young people are in different spaces right now. And so there's no question. I'm very clear that, but by the grace of God and this opportunity, I could have been on a very different pathway as well.
So after Duke, you pursued a career in the law. You went to Columbia. You were later the Assistant Attorney General in New Jersey, and you were also a partner at the firm Launstein Sandler. Tell me about that experience. So you come out of college, and were you thinking, I want to pursue a career in the law because of experiences you had, because you were interested in the subject? What was that evolution?
Yes, when I was in college, I thought I had a few options. I was thinking about becoming a civil rights attorney. I was thinking about becoming a business leader where I could hopefully be a part of bringing economic opportunity to communities. And actually, I thought about being a music producer because I was thinking at that time I may want to help shape the culture that affects how young people imagine themselves and think about themselves. I was always motivated to use what had been given to me to make things better for others because so many poured into me. I mean, we talked about it just a few, but so many people made possible the opportunities I had. So I wanted to be a part of doing that. And ultimately, I ended up deciding I wanted to be a civil rights attorney. Like those pioneers that came before my generation, the Jack Greenbergs and the Constance Baker Motleys and Thurgood Marshalls of the world and Robert Carters. I was really inspired by what they made possible for people like me. And so I wanted to follow in their legacy. And so that motivated me to law school. So coming out of law school, I clerked with a federal judge who was the former general counsel of the NAACP. Then I worked at a law firm called Wilmer Cutler, where the partner I worked with was John Payton, who was really one of the top civil rights lawyers of our time. And so I learned under him. So it really was connected to my upbringing where I wanted to be an agent through the law to create opportunities for other people.
So after that experience, so you're working at the firm, or you're working then as the Assistant Attorney General in the state of New Jersey. What brought you to your work in education? Or were you driven to get back to that origin? Because you talked about having that sort of compelling drive to kind of get back to giving back to the people and the institutions and the communities that have given you so much.
Yeah, so the sequencing was, so when I worked at the Wilmer firm, that was in D.C. right after law school. And I knew I always wanted to come back home and give to the city what it gave to me, because the city of New York has given me everything, and my family, of course. And so I worked with John Payton, who I just talked about, in D.C. for about a year, and it was very rigorous preparation. So then in 2001, I came to the Gibbons firm in Newark, where they also had a civil rights fellowship where lawyers were able to work at the firm and do civil rights cases. And so that kind of brought me back home, and what got me involved in education, because I always was very passionate about education opportunity. It obviously changed my life. As I came back home in 2001, a friend of mine introduced me to a gentleman named Ryan Hill, who had come through Kipp's Fisher Fellowship Program. Kipp at that time had about 2 schools. So the charter school framework had been created in places like New Jersey and other states in the late 1990s. And so Kipp started with 1 school in Houston, 1 in New York, and then did great things for kids. Families wanted more schools. And so Kipp was able to raise some resources to start new schools. And so Kipp created a training program to support principals who wanted to start new schools. And Ryan Hill came through that, and he was thinking about opening a school in Newark. And he had talked with a friend of mine from college who said, if you're thinking about opening a school in Newark, you got to meet my friend Shavar. And when I met with him, he told me about Kipp and told me that Kipp believes that the children are geniuses and can do all things. And that's the job of adults to cultivate that. And that's what the school would embody. Yep. And when I heard about that, I was like, I love that. We need that in my city of Newark. And he then asked me to be his founding board chair. And so this is 2001. And so we opened the first Kipp school in Newark. I was the founding board chair. He was our principal in 2002. And so all throughout, so this is obviously part-time volunteer work as a board chair and board leader. Yeah. So while I was doing all this litigation work, I also was helping lead Kipp as we grew and served more and more and more students in the city of Newark. So that kind of started me in terms of the education work that I now do on a full-time basis and have for a while now.
So was it right after that you became head of the Board of Education in Newark? Is that an elected position in Newark?
That is an elected position, yes. So yeah. I became the founding board chair of Kipp Newark at that time in 2001. We just had 1 school. Well, this is before we had any schools. This is before our charter had approved. We opened our first school, Team Academy, in 2002. Then I ran for the school board in Newark in 2010 and won. And I became the president. I'm probably one of the few people probably in the country, frankly, who've been the president of the largest public charter school network in the state, and the president and the chair of a larger traditional public school system in the state as well. And so, yes, I ran for that. I won, and then my colleagues named me the chair.
And how did you find that experience? So here you're leading, you're board chair, right, of Kipp in Newark, and then you're asked, or you are elected to the school board in Newark. What was the contrast like for you, or the different experiences between leading as a chair of a charter school and then working within the Newark public school system? What were you seeing on kind of both sides of that?
The biggest difference was the level of politics I had to deal with in the Newark public school system, which is understandable and can be a good thing. I think ultimately it's not in the best interest of kids. And so when I was a board president of Kipp and we would have our meetings, frankly, we were talking all the time about how do we improve results for kids? How do we support our teachers? How do we get the very best teachers into our schools? How do we keep the best teachers, pay them well, make sure our curriculum is rigorous, the students are growing, and that when they leave us, they're ready for college and competitive careers. And so when I got to the Newark school system, we had some of those conversations. We had many of those conversations as well, but we also had conversations about, well, what will this city council person think about this person being the principal? What will the mayor's office think about this? What will different political actors within the city, what will they think about not only that, and literally at the principal level, right? Because certain ward-based political figures would get involved in terms of the principals in their community and the jobs, right? I mean, obviously in a city like Newark, because we don't have the private sector labor market that can support our people, the public sector jobs play an outsized role. And so so given that, the elected officials are very much involved in deciding who gets which jobs, who gets which contracts. Oftentimes, some of the political actors will have people on their staff will have different jobs in other parts of the system. Yeah. And so then you have to deal with all that. And that's before you get to, pastors and the civic groups who want to weigh in on various matters. Then you have, 8 other elected officials who are in your school board, right? And they have not only their policy views about what public education ought to look like, but they have their constituencies that they want to be responsive to. And so you have to deal with all of that And so alongside just policy-based decisions and evidence-based decisions about, budget allocation decisions about what's in the best interest of kids, you then have to navigate through the political system and the political process. It's highly inefficient. It's highly diffuse. Then you're dealing with, because we represent the people, you have to manage the people's perceptions of what it is that you're doing, which means you have to have a mechanism to communicate effectively to the people, because those who disagree with any particular issue or any particular decision, if they have resources to communicate to the people about their perspective and do ways that may demonize yours, you have to be very mindful about that so you can maintain public support. And so it was definitely a baptism by fire, because on top of that, when I became the president, the Zuckerberg investments came into the city of Newark as well.
That's interesting. So in Newark, the mayor's office or the city council has some oversight or jurisdiction over the school system?
Well, not legally. So there's not, at that time,
it's politically, in terms
correct.
Of political power. Because I'm just, okay, so interesting. Because I remember in New York City, I think, did Mayor Bloomberg actually was there some legislation that was passed by the city council to give the mayor's office oversight of the schools? And there's that big push and pull, because it's very difficult, I think, at least in New York City, for the mayor's office to negotiate with the teachers union. Was that another piece of the puzzle in Newark? You had churches, you had community groups, and then you had the teachers union, and you had probably a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions and voices that, talk about really having a job where you're balancing a lot of different constituencies.
Well, I should have said the teachers union, no question. They're a huge entity. And obviously the voice of the teachers absolutely needs to be a very important part of the mix. But the teachers unions, very powerful in the city of Newark, very powerful in the state of New Jersey. So they had all types of things to say about all types of things. And they had, is very expert in using political levers in order to vindicate their interests. So they absolutely had a huge say, and and then remember, as board members, we're volunteers, and it was a very much full-time job. Now, what happens in places like Newark, even to this day, and definitely when I was on the board, but even to this day, we tend to have a number of board members whose full-time job is in the public sector. And as I talked about how, certain people who work for the school system will be connected to political actors and they kind of trade the jobs. We also see that on our school board, right? Where certain school board members will work for the county government, will work for the housing department, will work for other government agencies, where frankly, a part of their job is to navigate these politics. And then you get a person like me, and there's others, where your full-time job is outside of that. And then you have to come into this space and navigate in a way and shape this in a way that's going to be in the best interest of kids. You can see how it's very, very, very challenging. And frankly, when you want to make certain decisions that, that the political actors may not support, you then have to make sure you have an infrastructure to navigate and manage that. And it's very hard for volunteer school board members to have that kind of infrastructure. So it makes it very challenging to navigate in that context.
So was this you kind of in this role and seeing this dynamic and seeing the kind of role that the mayor's office plays, was that part of your impetus to, want to run for mayor? What was the timing of that around your service on the school board?
Yes, it definitely was.
You're being head of.
So I was on the school board 2010 to 2013. And then as my school board time ended in 2013, then I ran for mayor, because I did see, so my motivation was, I saw both during my time in state government. So I was in state government right before I ran for the school board. So I was in state government 2007 to end of 2009 under Governor Corzine. Governor Christie would beat Governor Corzine. So right after that, because I saw in state government, we were able to do so many great things to help people through the power of the government. So I was just very motivated by that and inspired by that. So that's why I ran for the school board. And even in the midst of all these issues, I'm very proud of the record we built on the school board, that our whole board did and that our district did. Newark was deemed to be one of the top, what's called beat the odds districts in the country, because a lot of the work we did together with our board and with our teachers and our educators because of that work. So I was very proud of that in the midst of a lot of political craziness, to be frank. And so coming out of that, I decided to run for mayor because I wanted to be more on the executive side, because I will say I wasn't well suited for the more legislative politics, right? So I have 8 other votes I have to get, and then you have to navigate, with the mayor's office, the city council office, the various political actors, county government, state government. You have to do that as mayor, no question, but you have a bit more power, to be frank. And so I was really excited to run for that, to have the opportunity maybe to be in that seat to try to move the needle for the people of the city. So that was kind of my motivation. And that was in 2014. So I ran 13 and 14 when my school board term was up in the spring of 2013.
And is it around this time, or it's before this time, that Mark Zuckerberg had come in and invested in, remind me again, was it a $100 million gift for the public schools in Newark? And who was in charge of distributing that? And what was that process? Was that given to the school board, or did he have a foundation or some kind of organization that oversaw the distribution of that money? I can't remember how that was handled. But was that, you probably saw the impact of that. Did that make a tremendous difference in how those schools were able to thrive?
Yeah, the Zuckerberg investment made a tremendous difference. So those monies came in the fall of 2010. So this was my first year on the board. I was elected in April, in spring 2010. And then the Zuckerberg's monies came in the fall of 2010. And it was $100 million from him. But it was a match grant that was matched 1-for-1. So it ended up being $200 million in resources. The Zuckerberg and his team actually set up an independent foundation called the Foundation for Newark's Future to distribute the money, which I frankly think was wise. I mean, a lot of people had issues with it, but honestly, the inefficiency and the bureaucracy of our school system, that wouldn't be if that was my money, I would do the same thing, right? I want a mechanism to make sure these dollars are spent in the most effective way. A lot of people in the system didn't like that.
That's what I was sort of thinking, because you were talking about, you have all those players at the table, and I'm sure each of them has their particular thing that they think the money should go towards, whether it should go towards teacher salaries or infrastructure or school meals or whatever. There's so many different things that you could direct money to at any school that, that's probably a big conversation about how the money is spent. And does Mark Zuckerberg's foundation decide how it's distributed, or does those different schools make presentations to him, or how was that rollout kind of handled?
Yeah, well, I mean, the rollout definitely was not ideal in terms of the politics and the public perception. So Zuckerberg's team set up a board and a foundation, and they would entertain, pitches from the school board and from other, players, if you will, who had an interest in what was happening in the Newark public school system. The board initially really wasn't representative or reflective of the local community, so that was obviously a concern. The board evolved over time, and I know over time they listened to some of that feedback and made some adjustments. But yes, so the board was able to make presentations. I had certain meetings during that time. Obviously, the superintendent at the time. So the philanthropic community would work with that team as well. And the bottom line is they made a bunch of investments. They paid our teachers. They put a lot of money into teacher pay and the bonuses for teachers, a lot of money in professional development. They funded the opening of new high schools within the city of Newark, like Bard Early College, which was one of our top college prep high schools in the city of Newark. They also funded the expansion of some of the public charter school sector as well. And their investments really were critical for that beat the odds designation I talked about earlier. And so there's a lot of politics, a lot of noise, a lot of arguing and fighting. But I'm very proud, though, that at the end of the day, the children were better off because of the work we did. And that's something all of us should be proud of.
The Zuckerberg Foundation, that's still ongoing, or was there a certain period of time that the funds had to be distributed to the schools?
Yeah, that was that. So the Zuckerberg, the Foundation for Future ended a number of years ago. I believe it was a 5-year commitment.
Oh, wow.
So I think it was from 2010 to about 2015. So all those monies have been spent several years ago. That foundation doesn't exist anymore. And so, so now, the system is trying to do the best it can, in the absence of those resources.
So you're coming out of this mayoral run. And how did you find that experience, by the way? I think I told you this, Shavar, that I'm on my town council and I won by one vote. And it was like really blood in the streets over this one town council seat. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot. I can't imagine. And I actually remember supporting Cory Booker. I grew up in New Jersey and supporting him for his second run for mayor when he had won, because I think he lost first to Sharp James and then he ran again. And I just remember hearing from him about the work that he was doing or knocking on doors. And I mean, it's a real, by the way, I think it's a great experience for every American to have running for public office, no matter what it is. But tell me what that was like.
I would agree with that. It was. So I ran for 2 races, won, school board lost the second, running for mayor. And I do agree, it's something every American, every human being, I think it's a exhilarating experience and a challenging one too. I love the knocking on doors. So I was relentlessly knocking on doors because I just love the people. I love the people of Newark, feisty, brilliant, tough, skeptical, mistrustful, loving, all at once. And I love the people, so I really enjoyed that part of it. But it is an exhausting process, right? So I have the utmost respect for people who run for office for the right reasons, because it is an unbelievably exhausting enterprise if you really committed to it, right? Because for most of us, we have to have a full-time job. There's a massive volunteer expenditure of resources, right? So on top of that, you then literally have to build a small business, basically, right? So we had hundreds of people who worked for us over the course of the campaign. You have to, every person I went to college with, law school with, family members, and would ask to do fundraisers so we could finance all of this.
I wish I knew you back then, Shavar. Because Newark is such as you said, as you started, when you became such an incredible city, and there's been such incredible growth in Newark over the past 25 years, and having the right leadership in that city is really important for the future of Newark and for the state of New Jersey. So you finished that race, and then did you decide at that time, is that when you got involved as in education reform now?
That's so about a year after that. So when the race was over, so I needed a bit of time to decompress. I literally ran for almost 2 years nonstop. And so we put tons of time and energy. So I needed a few months to kind of decompress and process the whole experience.
Why was it 2 years? Did you have a primary and then a general, or was it just the campaign was that long? Because I can't remember who you would have been running against.
I ran against Mayor Baraka. So Raz Baraka is the mayor now. We ran against each other in 2014. It was that long because I was just that relentless. I mean, I was very relentless because I was new. I didn't come, the mayor, obviously his father, his family, Mayor Baraka is an icon in the world. And others who were in the political process in Newark, particularly at that time, they tended to be connected to families that have been in politics for a long period of time. So I wasn't part of any of that. I was a young person. I was new, had only been elected to the school board, 3 years prior when I launched my campaign. And so I knew to be competitive, I had to start early. I had to raise money early. I had to knock on doors early. There's a lot of noise at that time around the reform work we were doing because it was very disruptive. I mean, we were working hard to disrupt the system because it needed to be disrupted. Kids weren't getting what they needed. But, change and disruption can be messy and can be, isn't always done well. And so I was running in the midst of that. And I was one of the leading people who wanted the system to be disrupted. The mayor kind of ran against that, which I think was favorable to him. And so in any event, it was a very long race. We were going at it constantly, and Newark politics is no joke. So after the race, I needed a few months to kind of decompress. And so I went to the Lowenstein Sandler firm as a partner, which was awesome. Great partners, great colleagues there. I did education, litigation, some civil rights cases, which were great. And then about a year into that, Education Reform Now came as one of my clients. And I ended up over time really just leading the work broadly beyond just the legal pieces and really overseeing all of the work, frankly, during my time there. And that was a tremendous opportunity because I was able to work in education policy and also be involved in supporting candidates who wanted to make a difference in education. Because I saw from my experience, if you don't have an infrastructure to support people who want to run and do the right thing, we're not going to be able to sustain change for young people.
Is that the mission for Education Reform Now, that they focus on funding candidates that are looking to reform education?
Yeah, so it has just 2 organizations. So there's a C3 which is Education Reform Now, and there's a C4 Education Reform Now Advocacy. So the C3 Education Reform Now is focused on policy change So it could be everything from teacher pay. It could be everything from accountability, right? Having tests and other evidence of whether kids are actually learning. It could be about the role of charter schools. So education reform now is a strong supporter of charters having a role in public education. But then the C4, education reform now, obviously that supports candidates. And so that's where that infrastructure, political fundraising, polling, communication support, independent expenditure, all of that support comes through that. And that is huge because when I had to run, I had to basically build all of that on my own, which is almost going to be an impossibility, frankly, for most candidates. I was just so young and relentless and was fortunate to have a lot of relationships that we came this close. Now, this close wasn't good enough, but we were able to build an organization that enabled us to be competitive. But very few people have the time, energy, or resources to do that. And that's where education reform now actually tries to fill the gap.
I want to jump back for just 1 second because I wanted to ask you about your door knocking in Newark. Was there one, because I found in my own experience, obviously nothing like yours. Yours was so much greater and more extensive. But I do think when you have that connection with constituents, you hear what they care about and what's on their minds. Were there consistent themes about what people were worried about or what they wanted to see in a mayor in Newark at that time?
There definitely were. And again, I love that process. I mean, there were themes of just people wanted an opportunity, particularly economic opportunity, wanted to find a decent job so they could take care of themselves, put food on the table for their families. That was a big issue. There's no question parents wanted good schools for their babies. They wanted to drop their baby off somewhere and they know when they pick them up, they're a little bit better each and every day and getting closer to their potential. Housing was a huge issue in the city then and still now. People struggling to find quality housing, affordable housing, stable housing. Crime, of course, was a major issue. We had big issues with gang violence then. We continue to have that now. That connects to the prevention services and making sure our young people have positive spaces and positive opportunities so that they're not choosing to go into the underground economy. Those are really the major themes that I would hear. And most of it was just a belief that those in office wanted to make a difference. There's just a lot of skepticism, I would say, too. Like there's just a lot of mistrust of people running for office. And so there was a lot of that, right? Thinking that the politicians just show up around election time and they're not really committed to change for the people. So you also have to deal with a lot of distrust as well.
I don't know if I said this to you or when we spoke or at another time, but I've always traditionally thought that not the Democrats were not in favor of education reform, but that they were not necessarily, generally speaking, supportive of charter schools. And that's not necessarily the case. Is that right? I mean, I think you were saying there's been some bipartisan support for charter schools.
Well, Democrats for Education Reform, part of its purpose is to create more political infrastructure so that more Democrats support education reform, including charter schools. The majority of Democratic voters of color, so Black and Latinx Democrats, support charters and consistently in polls. There's been tons of polls that consistently show that. But Democratic elected officials, particularly in very blue states, tend to be less supportive than their voters. And that's frankly because of the political strength of the teachers unions, right? So that's the bottom line on that.
Yeah.
And obviously they have every right. I mean, they have a certain set of political interests and they pool money from their members. And they then use those resources to advance their interests, and they're very strong and they're very influential. So they leverage their influence to get elected officials to support their platform. And so the voters are in one place in terms of poll after poll. But like on many issues, frankly, in our country, like gun control is another issue. There's tons of issues where we can say the voters are in one place, but because the way elections work and who actually turns out in elections, the elected officials can be in a different place oftentimes.
That's interesting. So Democrats for Education Reform is part of their work is to actually support Democratic candidates. Would you say they're kind of pushing back on that teachers union power dynamic a little bit and that funding source, right? Because that is part of it's campaign contributions, it's political power, it's all kinds of things that are influential, obviously, when you run. So that's having Democrats be able to be more aligned with many of their voters, depending on where they are, who their constituents are, is is a great thing, being able to give them that support, that resource support and that political support. Is it based out of DC, Democrats for Education Reform?
Well, yes, Democrats for Education Reform has federal PACs that are based in DC, and then also in different states
Okay.
we'll have state-based PACs that are connected to it. And there's a large number of elected officials who are strong Democrats for Education Reform. You know, President Obama really was the embodiment of what the organization stands for. He represented the agenda to the fullest. Because again, it's also not one, because in politics, people can make things zero sum. Like DFR totally supports teachers, believes in labor, believes in teachers and the teachers having an important seat at the table, but they just can't own the table, right? They should be at the table, but who should own the table are the children, right? The children's interest should be at the center of our education policy making table. But there's many, many senators in Congress. There's many, many state senators, state assembly persons, mayors, Congress people who support these issues. And DFR has been a very important part of creating an infrastructure that gives them room to do it so that it's not kind of political suicide, frankly, when they go back to their districts to embrace these issues.
I've always heard this as kind of a traditional pushback on charter schools, that if you are putting public funds and resources towards a charter school in your community, and you're taking the families that are engaged in their public school and trying to make their public school better, if you're pulling them away, if those families are actively looking for a charter school, it is somehow negatively affecting the performance of that public school. And I guess some would say, well, then that's a terrific thing, right? Because then that public school, if it's underperforming, maybe it closes and the kids go to the charter school. What are your thoughts about that perspective of some?
Look, I mean, I think there's truth in the notion that, sure, that if because the resources follow the child. And so if a child yesterday was in one system and tomorrow's in a new system, sure, there's an economic impact of that shift. We should be clear, the charter should receive a fraction of the full per pupil. So some of the money actually stays within the traditional system, even when the student leaves. But nonetheless, there still is some impact. There's no question of that. What I would say is the alternative is, then we just let the child stay trapped in a system that their parent is saying is not working for my baby. I might personally be willing to entertain that if we put a wall around our cities and said all of those who wanted to move to the suburbs over the last 30, 40 years, they got to stay in too. But if people can go to the suburbs because they're choosing different school systems for their kids and families because they have the economic wherewithal to do that, the notion that because a system that families are trying to escape might be harmed to some degree economically, if they choose something else, we should hold them captive to that system, particularly when the data is showing that the kids aren't doing well. So if you look at most of our urban public school systems serving Brown and Latinx students, we're talking about 8 to 10% college completion. And a lot of these numbers have been this way for 20, 30 years. And if you look at the proficiency results, you're seeing comparable results, 15%, 20% of the kids able to read, perform math on grade level. Some may get up to 30%. And so if that's what your legacy, if that's what your body of work is, at the least, parents should be able to have the choice to choose something else if there's alternate providers. And so yes, there's going to be some economic consequence when money follows the consumer of a public service and they choose another provider. But I would argue the benefits for kids, and frankly, the benefits for the overarching system, because the last thing I'll say here is, and I definitely saw this when I was in the Newark Public Schools, those systems need to compete. Because it's those who have these conversations in some abstracted sense about the traditional public schools and they making decisions all the time on the best interest of kids. It's like, you haven't been in one, have you? Because very insular, very frankly focused on adults, very focused on the comforts of adults. And I'm all about, I want a teacher being paid as high as doctors. But the system focused too much on the politics of elected officials, the politics of our teachers unions, the politics of patronage in a place like New Jersey, the politics of political parties and political bosses, as we call them in the state of New Jersey. And the kids' interests come at the bottom. And so as long as that's the case, these systems must be forced to compete, because it's through that competition that we can make it more likely that they're going to focus on babies as opposed to adults.
Well, that's right. And I think if you force schools to look at their budget and look at why parents are leaving. What's wrong here, right? It does then force the issue of them trying to address whatever those issues are, whether it's too many students in the classroom, whether it's an unsafe school, whatever the concerns are. To your point, it forces them to be sort of accountable for the outcomes of their students. So for a student that wants to go to a Kipp school, they have a Kipp school in their area, what is the process of them applying to a Kipp school? And I guess, what is that admissions process?
It's very straightforward. They just, now different, just like in the traditional public schools, different systems will have different paperwork you fill out, but you basically put a piece of paper in that says, I'd like to go to this Kipp school, and you're automatically admitted unless there's more families that apply than we have seats. In that case, there's a random lottery. So there's no admission criteria.
Lottery.
You're automatically admitted. Save the lottery if we just say we have 80 seats in a grade and we have 81 families applied, then you have to have a random lottery for that.
But if you see that there's such great demand in an area where you have so many people applying for the lottery, is that how Kipp then says, okay, this is another location that would be a good place to open another Kipp school? You talked about Newark having 6 or 7. Is that how that works? Or do people come to you and say, I'd like to open a Kipp school, charter school in my city or in my town?
That's correct. I mean, Newark, I think, may have maybe 12 to 15 now, but yes, that's what we would like to do. Now, to open new schools, though, we have to deal with the politics of the state. Right. Some states are very favorable to that. Some are not because of all the political issues we've talked about. Some say that some state level people may be favorable, but then the local people aren't. So then it's hard to get variant zoning approvals for space. It's hard to find buildings.
Right.
If the traditional public system doesn't partner with you, then we literally have to either build school buildings or we have to try to find appropriate space to lease, which is very difficult. But yes, wherever there's more demand, we seek to open more schools to serve that demand and serve our kids. But oftentimes the political process doesn't allow us to meet the demand that the families are demonstrating through the waiting list.
Which states would you say are most unfriendly to charter schools?
I would say New York. There's a hard cap in New York on charter school. Well, excuse me, Massachusetts. I should have said Massachusetts first.
Yeah.
Because New York will actually have a much larger proportion, at least in New York City. But I would say Massachusetts first. There's a very hard cap on charter schools in Massachusetts. There's a cap that's not as hard in New York. So New York is tough, but not as tough as Massachusetts. New Jersey is pretty tough recently. Under the Murphy administration, they've been dramatically less supportive of charters than prior administrations were. California, there's many challenges in California as well. So I would say those would be the states I would say are the most challenging. We have challenges everywhere, but those are where the challenges are the most difficult. And so we continue to kind of navigate with that and organize parents, message the right way,
And do you coordinate with organizations like Education Reform Now or Democrats for Education Reform, kind of identifying from them areas where they want to, I don't know if there's a lobbying component. I think you talked about a 501c4 as part of Education Reform Now, that there was a sort of a lobbying component to that. Will they go into those communities and do commercials or education about the better outcomes for charter schools and why having a charter school in those particular states is, beneficial for the kids that are there?
Yeah, so in terms of, yes. So now, not so much many years ago, but now there's a variety of organizations. So Education Reform Now, Democrats for Education Reform is one. And in different states, there are different organizations that are working to communicate to parents, to policymakers about the value of charters. So most states have a charter association. New Jersey has one. The vast majority of states with charter schools have them now. And their job is to bring parents, to bring parents to policymakers so that they can see, the value of charter, so that they can hear from their constituents. So if you're an elected official and you have charter families in your district, they'll go and talk to them and say, let me tell you what the school is doing for my baby. And
Yeah.
let me tell you about the impact it's having. And if you touch my school, you got to deal with me, right? So, so charters have been smarter about making sure the voices of our parents and families are being heard. Some of those, there's also state-based organizations that do a version of what Democrats for Education Reform does, which is run PACs, cultivate candidates to run for office. At KIPP, we're C3, so we're not involved in the political, in the hardcore political work. But of course, we will have our parents talk to their mayors, talk to their policymakers about their school and how they believe that their school is doing good things for their kids.
Well, I guess, so there's probably the funding for the Kipp Foundation, and then there's, I guess, each Kipp school can do its own fundraising initiative and probably has a different funding model, maybe depending on what state they're in, right? They get some money from public sources, but also I would think funds have to come from the private sector too. So you probably rely on philanthropic support.
Well, for our regions run our schools, and at the foundation, we support the regions and, similar to a franchise model. So we also have a role in terms of, quality control and what are kind of baseline expectations in terms of what it means to be a KIPP school. But the regions, the schools themselves as public charter schools are funded just like traditional public schools, except we tend to get less. So we tend not to get the full amount that traditional public schools receive. And so we have to then go to the philanthropic markets, to your point, to raise dollars, to raise resources, to try to cover that gap. Ultimately, we want to get to the point where we can run all of our schools entirely on the public per pupil.
Yeah.
Of course, we need our states to make sure we get the full per pupil. Like New Jersey, for example, you don't get facilities money, you don't get the full per pupil amount. So we need our policymakers to invest at the appropriate level. But yeah, part of my job at the foundation is to raise dollars so we can get them to our schools, and so we can get best practices to our schools and add value in other areas to our schools as well. And all of the money from the foundation is entirely philanthropically run, except we do receive a federal appropriation to support opening new schools.
Oh, that's great. So what is the foundation's budget per year, and how much money comes from the public support or government support, and how much comes from private, and how much, it's got to be a pretty significant amount of money that you need to raise every year, or that you need to bring in from both sources?
Yeah, so it varies, but we're roughly around $100 million currently. And so depending on the year, depending upon how many new schools we want to open, it could be 15 to 20, $25 million in terms of the federal support. And then the rest is raised philanthropically. And so I want to raise more and more, because the more we raise, the more we can invest in our 275 schools and support our teachers and support our school leaders. We also, in addition, though, to just investing dollars in the regions, we're also working to bring more best practices in those areas where our scale can provide unique value to our regions. And so we're working to figure out ways that our regions don't have to reinvent wheels as much, right, where we can learn from one another in real time, because we have so many common challenges throughout all of our schools. There's definitely some unique issues that different regions have to deal with, but we have so much in common. So part of our vision is to bring the benefits of scale to more of our regions, so that a job that is very difficult can be hopefully a little bit less difficult, because they can learn from the experience of their colleagues.
Was that sort of an idea of getting the leaders of all the different schools together, and is it also having some sort of like, and maybe this is a bad description of franchising, because I know that's not what you're doing, but I only bring that up to sort of have a standard, sort of, this is a KIPP school has these things, right? I know you have your mission statement, right? But there's certain training, or there's certain after school offerings, or maybe certain curriculum, or I don't know how you come up with that kind of uniform brand, right? What it means to be a KIPP
Well, that's a critical part of what we have to do, because the KIPP brand has such value and such equity because of the impact we've had for 30 years on the lives of kids. And so part of our role at the foundation is to kind of flesh out the base of meaning of what it means to be KIPP. So of course, what it means to be KIPP for us is that we deliver for kids, that we focus on kids who are in poverty, right, who have their backs against the wall. And it does mean that we have aligned curriculum, aligned assessments, so that we can better frankly, evaluate the degree to which we're actually delivering for kids. And even more importantly, we can actually support our regions and schools more effectively. When you have a lot of regions and schools running a lot of different programs, then it's much harder to support them because there's so much variability in practice. When we at least have a base that's common in curriculum and in some core leader and instructional moves, then that means we can provide more support nationally, and frankly, that other regions can provide peer-to-peer to their colleagues in regions so that we can support each other faster to deliver for kids. And so that's our role. And we're working with our regions to execute that in a way that can really make a difference for kids.
Well, you were talking about, you mentioned the pandemic and the effects of that and those gaps, right, that kids didn't get because they were learning online or they had a packet of materials. I would think that going to a Kipp school versus going to a traditional public school, because I know in the case of New York City, there were many people who wanted their kids to be able to repeat a grade because they had this massive gaps in their learning and they weren't given that opportunity. How has Kipp tried to support that, or have you found because of how you all are delivering your education that you didn't sort of suffer particularly as much as maybe some other schools because of how well you're run and how in contact your teachers are with your students? I mean, what were you finding as the aftermath of the pandemic with Kipp schools?
No, Kipp schools have been hit dramatically, just like all of public education, because our impact and value add is really rooted in what happens in the classrooms. And so when that was taken away and our kids were forced to learn from home, kids we serve, almost entirely students from low-income communities, didn't have a whole lot of access to high-speed internet, generally didn't have parents with the privilege of working from home. So their parents are out of the home trying to put food on the table. So their kids, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 at home trying to navigate through remote learning and have to do that in real time and to train educators in order how to deliver that effectively. So no, we were very, very significantly hit. So we're dealing with similar issues of learning loss and the need for academic recovery that we see throughout the country. We're also dealing with a lot of the issues we see in our communities, right? The pandemic hit the communities we serve in a very powerful way, right? So we also already had kids with housing insecurity, high levels of mobility, high levels of homelessness. That was exacerbated by the pandemic. The mental health issues, the trauma, the levels of violence we're starting to see as uptick in our communities. And so chronic absenteeism, so that's a percentage of kids who miss 10% or more of the school days. That has been up at historic levels. We're dealing with the same issues in terms of, many teachers feeling exhausted by the gravity of the challenge and choosing other pathways, right? Because obviously the teaching job, that's a job you got to show up in that classroom. So other opportunities, you can work from home, you can work remotely, you can't do that in education. And you're walking into school buildings with kids with extraordinary needs. And so the issues of teacher retention, issues of teacher recruitment, we're dealing with those as well. And so what we're working to do now to support our regions is what I talked about a bit earlier, which is aligning our organization a bit more closely so that the entire organization can support what's happening in our regions and our schools, and that they're not having to figure out so much on their own because it's too much to try to figure out in the aftermath of the pandemic. But we're dealing with all those issues and working very hard to make up the ground we lost and frankly get to even better than where we were before the pandemic.
So if parents or people listening want to get involved with supporting a charter school or lobbying for charter schools in their area, what kind of direction would you give or advice?
I would say first, connect with us. We're in most communities throughout the country. And so people go to kipp.org and connect with Kipp. We have amazing regional leaders, amazing school leaders, amazing teachers, and we can provide a lot of resources for folks. If they know they really want to primarily lobby, in almost all states, there's a charter association. And so depending on the state, they can just kind of Google that and there'll be a public charter school association in that state. And that is really set up to engage policymakers, engage civic groups, engage influencers on the value of charters, the impact charters are having, to frankly provide accurate information, because there's also a lot of misunderstanding in public charters, right? Because public charters is still relatively new. Some people think they're private schools, and we're just another type of public school, right? That just has essentially a nonprofit board as opposed to the elected board I was on. That's really the only fundamental difference. But it's a huge issue, given when you got a bunch of elected officials, there's a different set of conversation you got to have than oftentimes in nonprofits. And so we would encourage people to connect with us at kipp.org. We need more champions. We need more supporters. And their local charter associations, which are great organizations to connect people into charter-related advocacy.
Well, I think, here I have this statement about the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford found that charter schools are nationally outperforming traditional district schools in math and reading outcomes significantly, and that Kipp's results specifically, it says with Kipp students averaging what amounted to 46 additional days of learning in reading and 55 additional days of learning in math, which is well above the national average. So, when you're seeing these kinds of outcomes and you're seeing the impact it can make in children's lives, it is something that I feel like people should get involved in and champion these schools. And if they don't have the time to lobby for them and go, engage in that level, but they're able to support them financially, supporting the foundation is the best way probably to do that, right? Because you're the one who works on allocating the funds to the various schools.
Absolutely. That would, and we need that. We are the mechanism to get resources, financial and otherwise, to our schools. The Credo study you talked about, Leslie, speaks precisely to that. It shows exactly what you said. Our impact is significantly greater than districts, significantly greater than the charter school as a sector as a whole, bigger than standalone charters, and bigger than multi-state CMOs, right? So we have some of the largest impact of any education organization in the country. Again, Mathematica showed that for kids who attend Kipp schools for middle and high school, complete college at rates that would close the racial college completion gap. So for those listening to this who want to invest in this work, which I'm proud to say, we're one of the leading anti-poverty organizations in the country, kipp.org. We need all the resources. And you can know if it's invested in us, it's going to get to kids, it's going to get to babies, and it's going to have an impact.
Well, Shavar, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me today. Being someone who's watched Newark grow and continue to thrive, I know that it's a huge part of it. It's education, and it's just a real honor to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the work that you're doing there. And as a proud New Jersey native, I'm thrilled to know that you're at the helm of Kipp and supporting great schools in Newark and incredible schools all over the country. So thank you so much for the work you do, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for this platform you have to provide, good content on important issues to your listeners. And it's been a pleasure to be with you.
That brings us to the end of this episode of The Interview. A big thank you to Shavar Jeffries for joining us. And as always, thank you again for listening. If you enjoy the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Instagram at The Interview with Leslie Heaney. A new podcast is released every Wednesday. And until then, this is Leslie, and don't forget to join The Interview.